Well, good evening, friends, family, and faithful followers. Having brought you such heartwarming presentations as the Titanic tragedy, plague and pestilence and disaster at Darien, it's now time for grave robbing. Don't say I haven't cheered up your lockdown experiences, but I'm extremely grateful to you all for joining, and especially to John Aiken, who has been of enormous help during the booking process, and he's also handling the technology. Preparing these lectures has given me a sense of purpose, and I'm delighted to announce that in consequence, St. Peter's Church has benefited to the tune of over £500. So here goes. It's those ultimate grisly repurposers, the Resurrectionists. On top of the entrance to the tomb of the Earls of Linlithgow in St. Michael's Kirkyard is a metal coffin-shaped object. It is a mort safe, an article used to prevent robbers from getting access to a newly buried body. In the early 19th century, when it was placed over a burial, a heavy iron collar was put around it, through which strong spikes were driven into the ground. It bears the letters LMS, standing for Linlithgow Mortsafe Society, an organisation set up in February 1819. The members of this group could hire out the mortsafe to cover a relative's grave and leave it there until the body was no longer recyclable. These mortsafes in the cemetery at Logierate in Perthshire have attached spikes which were driven into the ground around an interment, sometimes with a heavy stone slab on top of that. The reason that such precautions had to be adopted was that in the early 19th century, freshly buried bodies were at risk of being resurrected. That is, dug up by tomb robbers and carried off from the graveyard. Graveyard theft was not a new event. Robbing from the last resting place of the recently buried had long been a problem. But since ancient Egyptian times, this had always been to retrieve valuable objects buried along with the deceased. By the time of the New Kingdom, that is about 1500 years BC, despite elaborate booby traps and false passageways, every single pyramid burial had been disturbed and the royal treasures within removed. Knowing this, that pyramids were hard to hide, Pharaoh Amenhotep I decreed that a new burial ground was to be created in a remote area near Thebes, in a spot dominated by a huge natural pyramid, now called the Valley of the Kings. However, even here, with the tombs hewn out of solid rock, and blocked by rubble and stones, the tomb robbers still got in. The value of the contents was just too much to be resisted. The wealth of Tutankhamun's tomb, for example, is estimated at around £500 million. His golden coffin alone is appraised at £9 million. And this in the tomb of a monarch aged just 19, before he had time to amass the kind of riches that great kings like Thutmose III or Seti I or Ramesses II would have had. The riches buried with rulers like those would have been far greater and much more opulent than anything in Tutankhamun's tomb. But sadly, we'll never know. They had all been grave robbed. And it was the items themselves that the raiders were after, not the mummified bodies. It was movable stash. And the objects were never actually sold, they were exchanged. Egypt was a cashless society until the coming of the Persians in 525 BC. And so the wealth looted from the tombs would not have been exchanged for money. Most likely the stolen items were fenced to a higher corrupt official who would have paid for it in material goods. He would then have the gold melted down to some other form and traded it for goods or services to an artisan. We do have several written confessions from ancient Egyptian criminals, those convicted of tomb robbing, as the court seemed to have dealt with these cases on an almost daily basis. The Maya papyri from the year 1108 BC, now in Liverpool Museum, records a number of cases detailing how those caught desecrating and robbing tombs were, quote, tortured at the examination on their feet and their hands to make them tell what they had done. Testimonies also are recorded by the authorities regarding the suspects, how they were caught, how they were treated. Punishments are most often recorded as beatings with a rod, a bastinade, on the soles of the feet and perhaps a flogging, but they could be as severe as amputation of the hands or even death by burning, so there was no body left to bury, a punishment to fit the crime of disturbing the eternal sleep of the Pharaoh. Several cases have been found where the apparent robber was buried alive. Despite this barbaric treatment, the rewards were so great that the robbing continued. From the 18th to the early 20th centuries, archaeologists found every single burial in the valley almost empty of its contents. Gradually, every known pharaoh was ticked off the list, until by 1921, only one tomb remained to be found, that of Tutankhamun, and the rest is the history of Howard Carter and his amazing discovery. Although even here, there was evidence of an early break-in, but in this case, the robbers, on being discovered, had fled, leaving the tomb in a jumbled mess, dropping a cloth holding gold rings. The tomb had been resealed, leaving the intact mummy with its wealth of 150 jewels hidden in the wrappings. So grave robbing was a problem for thousands of years. Across the world, a multitude of laws were passed against depriving graves of their buried goods. However, in no case was there any mention of the removal of the body, on the grounds that such an item was just not worth stealing. In addition, once Christianity dominated European religion, the resurrecting of a body in this manner was unthinkable, a morally heinous act, an abhorrent practice that no one would contemplate. The body had to be kept intact until the appointed day of resurrection, the day of judgment, the second coming, a belief that continued into the 20th century, leading to a strong opposition to cremation. William Shakespeare was all too aware of the potential dangers awaiting the possible disturbance of his body after death. His grave carries a warning he himself composed. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. Despite this, it is likely that Shakespeare's skull was indeed stolen from this very shallow burial. Archaeologists recently scanned the writer's grave in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon with ground-breaking radar, and they found that the bard's skull was missing, and that the rest of the skeleton of the renowned playwright isn't buried in a coffin. Instead, Shakespeare's body is wrapped in cloth and buried inside a grave less than 3 feet deep. There is indeed some evidence that his skull was indeed stolen in the late 18th century by trophy hunters. In 18th century Scotland, it wasn't old bones that grave robbers were after. It was freshly buried bodies, to be used as anatomy specimens by members of the medical fraternity. The rise of the professional apprentice-trained doctor-surgeons led to a dramatic increase in the demand for human dissection. Edinburgh had led this growing trend in the early 18th century with the appointment of Mr. Robert Elliott as the university's first, quote, public dissector in anatomy. In Glasgow, human anatomy was taught at the university by Thomas Brisbane from 1720 onwards, whilst in Dundee, originally part of St Andrews, Thomas Simpson began public dissection classes in 1722. Scotland, however, still lagged far behind the anatomy schools of continental Europe. And in every case, the problem was the same, the extreme difficulty in obtaining bodies. A legal mechanism for the provision of corpses had been reached between Edinburgh Borough Council and the Towns and Corporation of Surgeons and Barbers. However, this supply was limited to the bodies of those condemned to death and dissection by the courts. That quota was never enough, but it did provide a fairly steady supply, given that in the 18th century, hundreds were executed for a variety of crimes, some quite trivial. By 1765, within the so-called Bloody Code, 160 crimes carried the sentence of death. By 1815, it was even higher, but by then, most juries were unwilling to find people guilty for offences such as those you can see here. For offences like pickpocketing, rustling a sheep, stealing anything worth over 12 pence, 1 shilling, or poaching a rabbit. In those cases, by the early 19th century, the sentence was normally commuted, or the jurors would argue that the value of a stolen item was under the 12 pence penalty. Indeed, by the 19th century, only about 56 people were being sentenced to capital punishment each year. And with the expansion of the medical schools, as many as 500 cadavers were needed annually. Following pleas from medics, the authorities did add a few additional categories to the list of dissectable bodies, including deceased foundlings, abandoned babies, and suicide victims. An additional 19th century law reinforced the dictate that on no account was the body of a convicted murderer to be allowed a proper burial unless it was dissected first. The motive behind the act was, of course, not a desire to further the interests of science, but was in fact a further punishment designed to deter would-be murderers from their actions. Not only would they be executed, but their corpse would be mutilated and remain so for eternity in the afterlife. One to suffer this treatment was young Ralph Woodness, who was hanged at Linlithgow Cross on August 27th, 1819. Found guilty of housebreaking and robbery, he'd been sentenced at the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh, and the Caledonian Mercury recorded the aftermath. Quote, "After the pronouncement of doom, the offender was transported to the town where his crime had been committed, and so at Linlithgow Cross, between the Crosswell and the Cunseanuke House, a gallows duly awaited him. Provost John Boyd looked on as the prisoner was led from the toll booth, his body sunk under his remorseful feelings." And the newspaper goes on, "His boyish aspect and the weakness of his bodily frame meant a deep commiseration was expressed by the spectators. It appeared as if his career of crime was forgotten, and only a feeling of sympathy persisted for the trembling youth. Woodness joined with unaffected fervency in the devotional exercises, uttered a short prayer, and finally shook hands with the executioner as a token of forgiveness. 2 clergymen supported the lad as the noose was placed around his neck. They then stood back as the trapdoor opened and Woodness dropped to his death. His body was then taken away for medical dissection. The executioner, Thomas Young, retired to his temporary lodgings in the Cunseanuke pub, from where he sold off sections of the noose and the cord to onlookers, the origin of the phrase, money for old rope. Thankfully, those days are gone now, along with the Cunseanuke, of course, and all the other buildings at the cross. From the contemporary account, it would appear as if many in the crowd wished that these events were not happening. It would seem as if the crowd's attendance was driven by curiosity, as such public hangings were by then increasingly rare. Only one other public execution occurred in Linlithgow, when Peter MacLean was hanged at the cross in 1857. And the law had changed by then. He was not dissected, but buried in the yard outside the county prison, its spot marked by an arrow shown here by a council workman, where the police car park is now. Back in 1819, Woodness was one of only 10 convicts hanged in Scotland in that year, not nearly enough to supply the anatomists, who needed corpses almost daily, as the lack of refrigeration made the preservation of specimens very difficult. This chart shows that 68 were executed for their crimes in 1735 to 44, but only 21 between 1795 and 1799, with 86% of those sentenced to death being reprieved, and that trend continued. Many more cadavers were required, and so this demand for bodies created an illegal profession, that of securing bodies for sale. This shortage of corpses had not escaped the attention of the authorities, and they were concerned that many students were turning away from Scottish medical schools and going overseas to study anatomy. And consequently, a blind eye was often turned to the way in which university anatomists got their specimens. This was usually with the help of inebriated apprentice students who clumsily removed freshly buried pauper bodies from local churchyards or from poorhouse burial grounds. In these cases, the body was usually wrapped in a shroud dropped out of a pauper's coffin, like the one in the top right. It had a base that could be opened, allowing the wrapped body to fall into the grave. The coffin could be used again many times. This meant that some of the earliest 18th century grave robbers actually belonged to the gentleman class. Typically, a member of one of these gangs would loiter in a likely graveyard, waiting for a funeral. They might even join the burial party, expressing sympathy for the unloved deceased, just to get a closer look at the newly dug grave and more effectively plot that night's misdeeds. Contemporary newspaper reports with surprising indifference the occasional appearance of large holes in cemeteries and discarded grave cloths. However, the incidence of such grave robbing got worse and became an increasing problem throughout lowland Scotland in the early 19th century. By 1810, it wasn't just the bodies of the friendless poor that were in danger. Desecrated graves and smashed coffins appeared in most Scottish graveyards. This increased activity led to relatives trying to find ways to protect their dead. If religious factors allowed, they would delay burial until the body was unsuitable for dissection. Alternatively, they would get the gravediggers to mix straw or thick twigs with the earth placed over the coffin to deter the snatcher's shovels. Sometimes, if available, prodigiously heavy slabs of rock called mort stones were placed on top of the grave to further thwart the diggers. However, these methods did not deter the inventive grave robber. One method the body snatchers used was to dig just beyond the head end of a recent burial, and this was easy to find, as all burials at the time had the feet to the east, the head to the west, following the words of St. Matthew, "For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." Once the head end had been determined, the robbers would dig with a wooden spade, quieter than a metal one, and when they reached the coffin, often in a fairly shallow grave, they broke the end of it, put a rope around the corpse and dragged it out sideways. They were often very careful not to steal anything, such as jewelry or clothes, as this would cause them to be liable to a felony charge. Any objects found in the coffin, even the deceased clothing, was thrown back and reburied. An article in the Lancet in 1826 reported another method, saying, in the graveyard, a manhole-sized square of turf had been removed 15 feet away from the head of the grave, and a tunnel dug to intercept the coffin, which, due to overcrowding in the graveyard, was only 4 feet down. The end of the coffin was opened and the corpse pulled through the tunnel. The turf was then replaced and only small, remote disturbance was noticeable. Although it had doubtless happened before, the first recorded instance of grave robbing in Linlithgow that I can find was in 1821, when two so-called Resurrectionists were spotted making their way from St. Michael's Kirkyard across the Peel. They carried with them the recently buried body of Benjamin Jamieson, no known relation. And before they could be apprehended, they loaded it onto a cart at the Duke's Entry in the Blackness Road and made off towards Edinburgh. The actions of these resurrection men were generally deplored, as can be read in this poem, published in Linlithgow in March 1823. It's entitled Seizure Extraordinary at Linlithgow. It castigates the body snatchers as, quote, monsters who to churchyard take the road, and there they mark the greenest sod. They dig and bear the corpse away like tigers hunting for their prey. This is the original broadsheet, and it describes an event I shall now describe. A cart travelling along Linlithgow High Street was intercepted and examined. It had been followed from Polmont by a Mr. Scott of Gilston's farm. He had been herding sheep when he saw two men remove objects from a midden at the rear of Parkside Cottages, bottom left, a row of dwellings, incidentally, now nicknamed Resurrection Row. As he watched, the items were loaded onto a horse-drawn wagon, and to Mr. Scott's horror, he could see they were shrouded corpses. He ran for his horse, and pursuing the cart, riding bare saddle, he rode to Linlithgow, where he alerted the townspeople. A group of locals intervened, as the contemporary ballad continues. Brave Scott, who wins the words of praise, pursues the ruffians through their ways, nor stops until he overtakes, and lo, demands he boldly makes. Where is your warrant? My warrant's here. Secures his horse, the crowd then cheer, and while they send for legal measures, some near espy the monster's treasures. 3 naked corpses, shocking sight, indignant feelings burst outright, and without warrant, judge or jury, the crowd did beat him in their fury. The grim contents of the cart were indeed revealed as the naked bodies of a child and 2 women, one of whom was Janet Moir. She had been buried in Larbert churchyard just 2 days before. While the robbers were marched off to the Tolbooth jail and the cart set ablaze, Mr. Scott was carried shoulder high to the Westport, where in a hostelry he was feted with praise and alcohol. From Linlithgow Cross to the Westport, wherein Scotch drink and pints of port, its health is drunk, and all him praise. When parting, he emphatic says, the dead should rest till their last day, O watch lest they be stole away. You'll be glad to know the body of Janet Moir was reinterred in Larbert churchyard, and sometime afterwards, the trial of one of the body snatchers took place. Thomas Stevenson had such a record of similar nefarious activities that the book was thrown at him, as recorded in a contemporary report, which begins Monday, 2nd June 1823 at Edinburgh, the trial of Thomas Stevenson, who pled not guilty. Several witnesses testified, and their evidence clearly brought home the offence charged. The jury found the accused guilty of the crime. In defence, Mr. Wilson requested the court to take into consideration the time which the prisoner had already been confined, and also his ill treatment at the hands of the populace of Linlithgow. The judge, Lord Pittmillie, duly reprimanded the Linlithgow mob, saying that it was not for them to take the law into their own hands. But he then went on to say that the repeated offence was so grave that the full punishment of the law was required. Something must be done to stop the ever-increasing crime of removing bodies from graveyards. Stevenson was sentenced to transportation to Australia for 7 years. The proliferation of robbing cemeteries clearly saw the need for a more effective means of protecting a burial. One solution was the coffin collar, a stout iron necklace around the corpse and bolted to the floor of the coffin, designed to prevent the body from being dragged out. These examples were found at St Andrew's Cathedral and at King's Kettle, also in Fife. Other methods included reinforcing a wooden coffin with iron bands, or employing a range of iron hoops over the burial. If you were wealthy and you wanted to be absolutely certain your corpse would remain in its original packaging, undisturbed and unsold, you could always ask your heirs to arm your coffin with a torpedo. Coffin guns and grave torpedoes might sit secretly on the lid of a buried coffin, and if disturbed, fire lead balls at intruders. Or they might take the form of an explosive shell packed with gunpowder. These devices did injure some hopeful resurrectionists, warning others to think twice about where they stuck their shovels. However, not every parish was happy at this method of deterrent, nor the use of man-traps or spring guns. It brought all sorts of legal problems, especially if severe injury or death followed the discharge of the clandestine weapon. Other methods were more popular. In Linlithgow, Provost Boyd and the Reverend James Doby were active in the creation of the Linlithgow Mortsafe Society. the organisation, remember, that purchased the large metal cage mentioned earlier. It was securely placed over a recent interment in St. Michael's graveyard, and other groups followed their example, or if finance was available, they went even further by protecting the dead behind zoo-like cages. These ones are in Bothwell Cemetery on the left and Ramshorn Graveyard in Glasgow. St. Michael's in Linlithgow also decided to erect a watchtower in the kirkyard. These appeared all over Scotland, and watchmen were appointed to keep awake all night after a burial had taken place. These here still stand in the Culton burial ground and in Dalkeith Cemetery, and the one on the right is in St. Cuthbert's Graveyard, Edinburgh, and it can be hired and lived in as an Airbnb. Some of the guards stationed in these watchtowers brought their dogs with them, and there is evidence of the efficacy of this treatment. As you can imagine, it was very rare for a grave robber to keep a diary of his work, but one who did was Joseph Naples. He detailed a foiled attempt in August 1822, and I quote from his diary, "We separated to place a lookout, while the rest of the party proceeded into the burial ground. We could not succeed, as dogs flew at us." So watchtowers and watchmen did work, but such provision involved considerable expenditure, and it often depended on the calibre of the paid guards. Church and borough council records abound with complaints of caretakers falling asleep on the job, or getting drunk, or even being bribed by those anxious for bodies. I came across a local reference to the quality of graveyard guards in a piece in the Scotsman for February 28, 1824, in which two men from Nova Scotia complained of their treatment while visiting Linlithgow. With night falling, they decided to look at the palace, and while walking up the Kirkgate, noticed the gate to the cemetery was open. On entering, they spied a fire in the far corner and went to investigate. Immediately, they were pounced upon by, and I quote their letter to the Scotsman, "a rabble of several persons who stated themselves to be a guard over the recent burial, on top of which they had lit a fire. They accused us of being resurrection men and assaulted us in the most threatening and abusive manner." The Canadian couple were marched off to the house of the town's chief magistrate, Provost Boyd, now the Star and Garter, where they were cross-examined while their luggage was gone through. By now, a mob of baying locals had gathered outside, and it took 2 hours of persuasion by the provost and his son before they dispersed and the wrong couple could go free. Not exactly an example of Linlithgow's proud boast that St. Michael is kind to strangers, a motto depicted here on the early 18th century St. Michael's Well, 300 years old last year. One solution to grave robbing, favoured by some churches, was the construction of mort houses. These were literally abodes of the dead. They were fairly large, strongly constructed stone buildings with reinforced doors and iron-barred windows, designed as sanctified, as they were in the church ground itself, and also a secure resting place into which bodies could be placed for several days before burial, thus rendering the corpse unsuitable. Such precautions saw those intent on the lucrative trade of supplying bodies adopting more horrific methods. These were the true body snatchers. To begin with, these nefarious characters preyed on the bodies of those who had died and were unclaimed by relatives, itinerant travellers, the down and outs, paupers, the elderly and friendless. Purporting to be relatives, keen to claim the bodies of a distant loved one for a proper burial. Their real intention was, of course, a late night visit to the back door of an anatomy school. I used to ask those attending my ghost walks, that's me on the left, who are the most famous grave robbers in history? And the usual reply I received was Burke and Hare. But of course, there is no evidence that these two gentlemen ever obtained their bodies by stealing from a grave. They may have got inspiration for their body-selling deeds while working as navvies on the Union Canal. And of course, the canal offered another means of smuggling bodies along the waterway into Edinburgh. One story locally is told of a barge being examined at Linlithgow's canal basin for such hidden carcasses. Nothing was found, and the barge went on its way, with a very silent, fully dressed bargee sitting deathly still at the front of the boat. William Burke and William Hare undoubtedly would hear stories of grave robbing and corpse smuggling all across Linlithgowshire at the bar of the Market Tavern opposite Linlithgow Cross. They would listen intently to how extra cash could be obtained from selling bodies to medical practitioners in Edinburgh, no questions asked. However, Burke and Hare never robbed graves. They murdered, and there was a ready demand for their victims. In the early 19th century, Edinburgh had several pioneering anatomy teachers, including Alexander Monro, John Bell, John Goodser, and Robert Knox, all of whom developed the subject into a modern science. Because of their efforts, Edinburgh became one of the leading European centres of anatomical study, but they all needed bodies on which to practice and demonstrate anatomy, and Burke and Hare duly obliged. Their murderous career began with a natural death. When an elderly soldier, Old Donald, died while living in Hare's lodging house in Tanner's Close, just off the Grassmarket, the pair decided to sell the body. They removed him from the coffin, which had been delivered to the lodging house, and filled it with spent bark from a nearby tannery. This coffin was duly buried, while Old Donald's body was secretly transported to Dr. Robert Knox in Surgeon Square. Prices were agreed: £8 during the summer, when the warmer temperatures brought on quicker decomposition, and £10 in the winter months, when the demand by anatomists was greater, because the lower temperatures meant they could store corpses longer, so they undertook more dissections. Burke and Hare were hooked, and at least 16 murders followed. Their profits went largely on drink, and they were hardly the cleverest of assassins. Their last victim, a children's entertainer named Daft Jamie, his real name was Jamie Wilson, was recognised by one of the students at Knox's anatomy lecture, who declared he had seen the boy alive and well the day before. It also didn't help that the body of Margaret Doherty was found under a bed in Hare's lodging house. It was also a mistake to dress Hare's son in Daft Jamie's breeches. When they were arrested, William Hare, following an offer of immunity, turned King's evidence and confessed, saying that although he had helped carry the bodies and sell them, it was William Burke who had done the killing, aided and abetted by his wife, Helen McDougall, and there is some evidence she came originally from Whitecross. The trial began on Christmas Eve, 1828, and lasted throughout the day and all the night until 9:30 a.m. on Christmas morning, non-stop. The evidence of Mrs. Margaret Hare was pretty farcical, given that she claimed to have lost her memory, and the baby she was cradling regularly interrupted proceedings with bouts of whooping cough. The jury found Burke guilty of the murder of Margaret Doherty, the only crime where a body was available. Helen McDougall's case was not proven. As he passed the death sentence against Burke, Lord Justice David Boyle told him, quote, "After hanging by the neck until death, your body will be publicly dissected and anatomized. And I trust that if it is ever customary to preserve skeletons, yours will be preserved, in order that posterity may keep in remembrance your atrocious crimes." An Irvine man, Judge Boyle is commemorated in his native town with this statue. He is Irvine's Green Man. And his predictions proved correct. Burke was duly hanged on the morning of 28th January 1829 in the Lawn Market, in front of a crowd possibly as large as 25,000. A place at the windows in the tenements overlooking the scaffold were hired out at prices ranging from 5 to 20 shillings. On the 1st of February, Burke's corpse was publicly dissected. This was done by Professor Alexander Monro in the anatomy theatre of the university's old college. It's still there, and guided tours can be arranged. Police had to be called when large numbers of students gathered, demanding access to the lecture, for which a limited number of tickets had been issued. A minor riot ensued, and calm was restored only after one of the university professors negotiated with the crowd that they would be allowed to pass through the theatre in batches of 50 after the dissection. During the procedure, which lasted for 2 hours, Monroe dipped his quill pen into Burke's blood and wrote, "This is written with the blood of William Burke, who was hanged at Edinburgh. This blood was taken from his head." And true to the judge's wishes, Burke's skeleton was given to the Anatomical Museum of the Edinburgh Medical School. It is now on display, along with his death mask and a book bound with his tanned skin at Surgeons' Hall Museum in Hill Square. Rumour has it that the book was covered with the skin from his buttocks, as it had a very natural fold. On the last time I went to the museum, one curator called it Burke's bum book. Knox faced no charges for the murders because Burke's statement to the police exonerated the surgeon, saying that he had no part in the killings. However, as public awareness of the news grew, many in Edinburgh thought he was a, quote, sinister ringmaster who got Burke and Hare dancing to his tune. And a popular rhyme at the time went, "Up the close and down the stair, butt and ben wi' Burke and Hare. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knox the boy that buys the beef." The disgraced anatomist resigned from his position at the College of Surgeons and was gradually excluded from university life by his peers. He left Edinburgh and departed Scotland, not, as some accounts used to report, as a beggar in London, his eyesight affected by being pelted with quicklime. He actually went on to lecture in London and abroad until his death in 1862. A new word was coined from the murders, burking, meaning to grip a victim's nose and with the same hand close the mouth so as to smother the target. This method of killing without leaving any sign on the body inspired a group of body snatchers in the English capital, the London Burkers, who were active in 1831 until being arrested and hanged. The London Burkers case and that of William Burke raised public awareness of the need for bodies for medical purposes and of the trade that doctors had conducted with grave robbers and murderers. A bill was quickly introduced into Parliament and gained royal assent 9 months later to become the Anatomy Act of 1832. The Act provided for the needs of physicians, surgeons, and students by giving them legal access to corpses that were unclaimed after death, in particular those who had died in prison or the poorhouse. Furthermore, a person could actually donate their next of kin's corpse in exchange for an eventual burial at the expense of the recipient. Under the Act, those intending to practice anatomy had to obtain a license from the Home Secretary and be subject to inspection. The time of the body snatchers, the scourge of the resurrection men was over, leaving behind just a fascinating period of history, some gory stories, and a couple of pubs named after their misdeeds, the Diggers next to Dalry Cemetery, and the old Crown Inn close to the Pennicook graveyard, still displaying the pub sign of a previous incarnation as the Robbers. The Linlithgow Mortsafe Society was wound up, its remaining funds divided amongst the members. The dead of St. Michael's could sleep in peace unless disturbed by rabbits. The old Mortsafe was placed over the entrance to the burial vault of the 3rd and 4th Earls. Ironically, in 1980, the Mortsafe was pulled aside and robbers entered the tomb to desecrate and steal. But that's another story. Tonight's story is over. Thank you.
Brilliant, Bruce, thank you.
Thank you very much. Happy stuff, eh?
Yes,
A laugh a minute.
that was really, really good.
If you want to ask a question, unmute yourself and just raise your hand and we'll go through you.
You can actually click a little button and well, I can't see you all, of course, because I've only got one page up.
I can see everybody. So who would like to ask a question?
My question is, there are many stories of
resurrectionists, trying to pull rings off fingers or cut rings off fingers and people waking up screaming and things like that. Did that ever happen?
I can find no record for the reason I said that if they stole something, the law was far more severe. The law didn't account for removing bodies because nobody ever thought of it. So
Yes.
I think that's fallacious. I've heard of one where they cut a finger to get a ring, and the
That's
person
it.
had been buried alive and came to life.
Yes.
Apocryphal, I think.
Yes. Okay. Good to know.
In St. Michael's graveyard, a little silver bell was found. And I wondered if quite often they put bells in the coffin so that if you came to in the coffin, you could ring for room service. Danny.
There's a very well preserved mort house over at Crail Cemetery. It's
All right.
quite a substantial building.
Thanks. There are a lot in Fife. I've seen a few in Fife. There's one in Bearsden Cemetery as well. But Fife, for some reason, seemed to have a lot. It caught on in Fife. There were maybe more robbers in Fife. Sorry, Christine.
Yeah, close to St Andrews University.
Yeah, well, two. That's right. You've got the medical school nearby.
That was good.
Anybody
Bruce.
else want to ask a question? On you go, Neil.
Bruce, I was saying that the actual method of burking was putting your hand over his mouth and his nose.
Yeah.
Did that just come to light at the trial? And is that how the folk down in London discovered how to do burking?
Burke admitted to using that, and of course William Hare backed up that as well. But because only one body was actually found at Burke's trial, the rest were all anatomized. They could only go on Margaret Doherty, but she had been burked, so
Right.
they were able to show that.
Okay.
Tom Pollock, I see Tom Pollock there. Tom, did you notice my little bit about William Shakespeare? I've never been to Stratford upon Avon. That's an in-joke, folks, sorry. I hope you got some enjoyment out of that. It certainly helped me to do the research. I quite like bringing in the local history, and there was some nice little bits of local history. The bit about the two Nova Scotians being assaulted and dragged along to the Star and Garter was a nice little find. I joined something called the British Newspaper Archive, and I thoroughly recommend it because you can look by names. So I looked up grave robbers, Linlithgow, and discovered quite a lot. They do the Gazette, the West Lothian Courier, the Scotsman, and that's how I knew there were hundreds of cases of grave robbing. Andrew Sutherland, I nearly thought of you there when I did St. Michael is Kind to Strangers.
That was good. That was good. We both enjoyed that. It was very good. I hate to say it, but it was entertaining. It was entertaining.
Upset at Burke's bum book. Sue, I do apologise, Karen.
Anyway, everybody, I think, Bruce, we are very, very grateful to you for taking all the time and effort to put that together. It's produced an excellent amount of money for St. Peter's Church, but it's also entertained every single one of us. It was a most excellent presentation. And I think if you could all join with me to thank Bruce in the usual way for really a very entertaining talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Great to see you all. We'll meet again. I'll be doing more at the next lockdown.
Thanks again, Bruce. That was absolutely excellent.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you.
Again sometime.
Bye.